So first, I just wanted to explain a little bit about how we came to create the Accountability Council. I'm the founder and director, again, of Accountability Counsel, which is a global nonprofit organization, and we amplify the voices of communities around the world to protect their human rights and environment. And the reason we do this is because we've seen for the past number of decades that communities around the world often are negatively impacted by international financial flows. And many of these communities are some of the least heard by decision makers who are making important decisions about where projects will happen, such as dams, mines, pipelines, how they will happen, and who will get impacted, who will feel the social and environmental risks borne by those investment decisions. So the people least heard are those often most affected, and those are the people who we support to be participants in the process of raising their voice to a grievance mechanism to be heard. So if we can go to the next slide, the way that we do that work is by using non-judicial accountability offices. They're also called independent accountability mechanisms. And these are not courts, but rather they are created by institutions to give people a way to be heard directly from communities who are impacted. So not going through local government, not going through a regional court, not going through a judicial process, going straight to the institution that has financed an investment. And they have independent decision makers who can either investigate a complaint alleging harm, or they can support dispute resolution or mediation, where the communities and other actors who are stakeholders can help reach agreements. So we work through our communities program, our policy program, and our research program. And the communities program is made up of lawyers who are directly working at the request of local people to help them raise their grievances to these accountability mechanisms. Our policy team is looking to make sure that the system is just and accountable, and to look for gaps and help to support advocacy to fill those gaps where no accountability offices exist, but there are outward financial flows. And then finally, our research team does a lot of work on data and tools that both support our communities and policy teams to be more effective, but also produce tools for the field as a whole and the global community engaging at a variety of levels. So with that, the problem that we see and why we created this accountability console is that every year millions of people are harmed by dams, by mines, by pipelines, agribusiness projects, and increasingly renewables projects. And they're filing these complaints to an increasing degree, and there are more and more complaint offices or accountability mechanisms that are being created each year. But without aggregate information, there's really no way to capture the valuable information that we're learning from this system that can be actionable for a variety of stakeholders. So if we go to the next slide, here's what we've done about it. We've created a centralized database of every complaint ever submitted to any accountability office since the beginning of their creation in the mid-90s up into the present. And this is a system that we really hope will be of value to all of you who are dialing in today, to communities around the world, to policymakers and governments. And if we go to our next slide, the work that we've done here at Accountability Council is really geared toward supporting our own team of lawyers and policy advocates and our own team of researchers, but also there are a variety of stakeholder groups that we're hoping to support with this console. I've mentioned communities and their advocates as users of the database, asset managers and insurers, as well as philanthropists and investors. When they're making investment decisions, when you're doing due diligence, these are all people who what's happening to those complaints over time? What is the influence of filing a complaint on a community or an investment? Finally, we have philanthropists. Besides philanthropists and investors, we then also have policymakers and governance professionals. So the people who are deciding what the policy is that governs both an investment and the accountability surrounding the process of raising a grievance. Researchers and journalists will find an enormous amount of valuable information in here that's worthy of follow-up. And then IAM, or independent accountability mechanism professionals, to see how their work fits into the whole web of cases that have been brought over time and the implications for their own work and field as it develops. I do want to mention that this is a growing field. We had only one accountability office in the mid-90s when I started working in this field. And along with so many of you on this call today, we've really grown this field enormously to see this large number of complaints, almost 1,300 complaints in the database now, that make this a really interesting and important time to start looking at the field as a whole from a data perspective. So with that, I believe I'm able to turn it over to my colleague, Samar Arabi, who's our research director at Accountability Council, who will do a demo of how to use the Accountability Console and what it is. And then we will do some question and answer through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen there below. So with that, I will turn it over to Samar.
Great, thank you so much, Natalie. And I'm super excited to be here with all of you today to talk about the console. It's really been a labor of love for the Accountability Council Research Department. It's been our flagship project basically for the past 2 years, and has really kind of influenced all the work that we've done, even our additional work in the policy team and our work that we've done on particular cases, always sort of informs how we're thinking about how we're building out this system. And it's been a really useful tool for us. It's been a really exciting process to build from scratch, and we're really thrilled to share it with all of you today. So what I'm going to do is walk you through how this system works. Natalie mentioned a few of the user groups that we feel like derive particular value from this system. So what I would like to do today is to go through 2 use cases, so 2 different types of users who would use the console and how we imagine them going through that process. And if you like, in the Q&A, we can probably dig deeper into some of the other user groups if you'd like to explore them as well. But what I'd like to do now is go through using the console as a community member or an advocate for a community member who might be affected by a project and wants to understand what options exist to protect their rights. And then when I've gone through that process, I'll do it again as an investor who might want information about key risks that they should be aware of before investing in a project in an emerging market. So for our first use case, we can imagine that we are community members or the advocates of community members in Honduras, and we're concerned about a hydroelectric dam that's being constructed near our village. And so that community might have questions about how that dam would affect their safety, the safety of the broader community, their access to drinking water. But as is sometimes the case, those communities may have received really limited information about the project's health and environmental impacts. So that community might be able to connect with some sort of regional civil society organization who may be able to identify the financing for that project. And in this case, we can imagine that maybe they identify that the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB, is financing the construction of that dam. That means that an accountability mechanism exists where this community can raise concerns about this IDB finance project. But as is almost always the case, these communities and often the local organizations that support them don't necessarily know a lot about accountability mechanisms or how accountability mechanisms work. And so, the first thing they probably want to do is really understand what to expect before deciding to pursue some sort of complaint strategy. And so, in addition to the actual information itself, we really built out the system to try to be as informative as possible for people who are relatively new to this space. So even right here on the homepage, which I hope all of you can see there's just some high-level information about what this database is, what features it contains, some information about what an independent accountability mechanism even is, a map of where complaints have been filed, information about what sort of data is contained in the system, and then some high-level information about the user groups that Natalie had mentioned earlier, so that if you come on here as a community, you can kind of see how we expect you might be able to derive value from this system. So looking at this kind of high-level information, again, if we're going through this as a community in Honduras that's concerned about an IDB-financed hydroelectric dam, what we might want to do is look at complaints that fit those criteria. So we might want to browse complaints that have been filed to the IDB's accountability mechanism. It's called MISI, the Independent Consultation and Investigation Mechanism. And we might want to filter those down even further to look at complaints specifically in Latin America and the Caribbean. So, what we're trying to do here is drill down into other complaints that sort of match the use cases that we envision as a community. So right off the bat, we can see that there's 147 complaints that match those two pretty basic filtering criteria. And we can just immediately scroll down through this list of complaints. And one of the things that probably pops out to you right away, looking at this list, is that the overwhelming majority of complaints here, you can see the status seems to be closed without outputs, which means that the communities that are engaging in this process are failing to get through some sort of substantive stage. There are obviously a lot of different reasons for that, and that might be a complicated thing to parse, but as a community who's interested in pursuing this strategy, you can imagine why that would be a really concerning thing to see. So, in addition to just kind of seeing this information, what we really want to do is provide a tool for people to understand. So instead of just looking at this as a kind of endless list, what we can do is use the visualize feature to understand a kind of graphical representation of what these 147 complaints look like. And so instead of the list, we can visualize here the kind of timeline, like the complaints have been filed over time, the outcomes of these complaints, and sure enough, like we saw in the list, it looks like 80% of complaints that are filed to the IDB's accountability mechanism in Latin America are being closed without outputs, meaning they're not getting through these substantive stages. And we can also, by scrolling down a little bit more, see how long these complaints typically take, but also a little bit of information about stage breakdowns. And this actually allows us to figure out what the bottleneck is for these complaints. And we can see it's actually right here in eligibility, meaning that 4 out of every 5 complaints that communities are filing aren't making it past this eligibility stage, meaning that they're not meeting like the threshold of eligibility that is set by this particular accountability mechanism. It's worth noting, just kind of as an aside, that there are a lot of reasons that a complaint might not be eligible. It might not fit within the mandate of the mechanism. It might have failed to adhere to kind of the specific policies of how to file a complaint. So the ineligibility doesn't necessarily say anything about the validity of the complaints, right? But as a community who's interested in possibly pursuing the strategy, this is a really worrying number for us. We want to make sure that we're in this 20%, that we're able to navigate through the system to make sure we can use it as effectively as possible. So what we probably want to do with that then is narrow down our search further to find things that really match what we're looking for. And in this case, what we want to look at are complaints that have successfully closed with outputs. We can filter that right here from the visualize feature. And we can see here now we've narrowed it down immediately to 12 complaints that are really quite close to what we're trying to do, but we can filter it down even further if we want to get really granular information that applies to our use case. So instead of looking at all the complaints in this region with this outcome, we can specify that we want to look at complaints that have been filed regarding energy projects, right? Like our hydroelectric dam. So we can filter that down even further. And now we've gone from 1,300 complaints to 150 complaints to a dozen or so down to 4. And these 4 complaints, might have really specific information that might be useful to us. So we can go ahead and open one of these complaints to get a sense of what's inside it. And we can see immediately here a bunch of high-level information about this complaint. We see the issues that the complainants raised: biodiversity, consultation and disclosure, displacement. We see the sectors that the project is located in: energy and infrastructure. High-level information about the project, including links back to the IDB's own project registry. High-level information about the complaint, including a link to MISI, the accountability mechanism of what the complaint was and what happened in the complaint process. And importantly here, complaint stages. So again, if we're dealing with a community or advocates for a community who don't necessarily know a lot about what a complaint process looks like, this provides a great opportunity for them to really understand the different components of it and the overall timeline for it. So we've got here all the different stages that this complaint went through. And we can see right off the bat that, for example, the time from filing to closure was just under 6 years. And then, if we don't want to count the monitoring piece, the time until we reached through a substantive stage was just under 4. That immediately is useful information for this community to know. But also, we can dig into each particular stage a little bit more too. So we can see here, for example, that in this particular complaint, dispute resolution wasn't undertaken, and we can see why. The explanation here says that the company or the government refused to go through a dispute resolution process. Now, again, as a community that's considering the strategy, that's really valuable information for us, because if we're interested in doing some sort of mediated dialogue as part of our strategy, we want to make sure that we're considering how we can make it most likely that the company or government involved is willing to come and have a seat at the table. So we know that this didn't happen in this particular complaint, but we can also see that a compliance review did happen. And so in this case, we can see that a compliance report was published and non-compliance was found. So this already tells us something really important, because now we have an independent, verified affirmation of some of the concerns that this community made in their complaint. And again, instead of just looking at this kind of high-level information here, we can actually dig into the actual complaint documents themselves, which are all contained on each complaint page. So we can actually read that compliance report right on the site. So we'll give it a minute for it to load. And here we can see the accountability mechanism for the IDB, their compliance report for this particular project. And this is going to have a whole lot of really important high-level information for us. We've got the important terms, background on the project, the background on the complaint, how it was handled by the accountability mechanism, and some of the principal findings. So we can see right here that there seem to be failures in 3 key areas of the bank's operational policies. So we see a violation of the environmental and safeguards compliance policy. We see an issue around access to information, and a violation of the indigenous peoples policy around failure to consult with local indigenous communities. So what we have now are independent verified findings of an allegation in the complaint. So we can use this information as a community or the advocates of that community to really understand how those particular policies might also apply to our case. And we can kind of envision how to raise those policies if we do decide to file a complaint about the situation that that community is facing. But even before that, we can also use this information and the findings from this compliance review to engage directly with the IDB, for example, to demonstrate that maybe the problems that our community is facing are part of a known pattern, and use that information to push for some kind of early preventative remedy instead of going through a complaint process and dealing with these issues retroactively. And so, it provides a few different tools for us that we may want to use. And in addition to that, what we've also got here is, going back to the complaint page, information on the groups that were involved. So we can see here that we know that the Indian Law Resource Center was involved in this complaint, and we could reach out to them for advice, to learn about their experiences going through this process, to see if they have any information or resources that might be useful to us. So that's all the information that we're able to kind of glean immediately just from this complaint page. But one other thing we can do here is to follow this complaint, which basically means that if any new information from this complaint comes out, if any new stages are developed or any new documents are being published, we're able to get that information on the dashboard of the console, but also emailed to us directly. And then one last thing that I would love to mention about this page is, as we're going through this use case, some of you are probably already thinking about the idea that, okay, if we are talking about a community in Honduras, one of the really big barriers for accessing and really using this information is going to be a language issue, right? All of this information is presented in English. So some of the documents as they're produced are actually produced in Spanish, which is useful, but to make that site itself more accessible, what we've done is add a auto translate feature that allows communities to kind of automatically translate this into multiple languages, which I'd be happy to show you later. It basically, you click a button and it translates to it auto translates to any language that Google Translate has available. So if anyone would like to see that, I'd be happy to demo that feature later. So all of this is information that we're able to glean directly from the complaint page. But in addition to just looking at the complaint, as a community or the advocates for that community, we're probably also really interested in learning more about the accountability mechanism itself. You know, going back to what we were looking at earlier, this question of the low rate of eligibility for these complaints, we need to make sure that we're engaging with that accountability mechanism as effectively as possible to really ensure that, you know, we're not doing any, we're not inadvertently missing any requirements that that mechanism might have for how to get that complaint effectively into the pipeline. So from this complaint page, we can actually jump directly to the page for the accountability mechanism itself, to the MISI page. And once again here, you can see high-level information about the accountability mechanism, about the bank that it sits within and the mechanism itself, a description of the office itself, a map of where the complaints have been filed. And then below that, we have what we call benchmarks, which is a series of policies of the accountability mechanism and of its associated bank that relate to how communities can file complaints. And so, you know, we've got about 200 of these benchmarks for each of the institutions, but, you know, rather than going through that whole list, we can say we want to look specifically at eligibility requirements. So we want to understand how we can get through that eligibility bottleneck. So looking through all of these different questions, we can maybe click on one in particular to get a little bit more information on it. We can see here, you know, the question is, must the complainant allege specific violations of the institution's policies and procedures? And, you know, while we try to answer these questions with like simple binaries where possible, where we can say yes or no, sometimes the answers are really nuanced. And we really make an effort to make sure that we capture that nuance. And you can see that here in the notes. It says, complaints must include a clear explanation of the alleged harm and its relation to the non-compliance of the relevant operational policy if known. So for this particular mechanism, if it's possible, you know, the community is sort of expected to identify the policies that have been violated in terms of the harm that the community has faced. That's really valuable information for us to know as well. So now we know that if we do decide to pursue a complaint strategy, we really need to make sure that we're noting the policies that were violated, and our ability to look through existing compliance reports does a lot to make sure that we can really easily identify and name those policies, which we wouldn't have necessarily been able to do otherwise. We should also note that the citations for all of these benchmarks are included right here. So like if you wanted to see the original documentation from MISI's operating policies that relate to these issues, you can pull them up right here, and it actually jumps right to the page and paragraph that relates to that particular policy. And then one last thing that I'd love to note on this page is that we also do a quick comparison of all the other mechanisms as they relate to that same question. So we can see here that while other mechanisms also sometimes have a kind of nuanced answer to this, this isn't a requirement across the board. And some mechanisms don't require this at all. And we find that this is a really valuable tool for policymakers and policy advocates as a way to just show that we have data-driven information that can be used to encourage each of these accountability mechanisms to strive for best practice, right? Because you can kind of see what other mechanisms within this ecosystem are doing, and use that as a way to encourage people who may have different policies to kind of adhere to the more standard norms of those policies. So we find this feature to be a really useful, kind of efficient way to pull that information out. So the use case, what things have we learned here? You know, we've learned that there are other complaints that are similar to the complaint that we might consider filing, that we have a whole host of specific actionable information that we can use as we engage with this particular development bank. And importantly, I think we can see that the experiences that this community is facing fit into a broader ecosystem that, you know, relate to other experiences that other communities have faced from other projects, and that creates a kind of shared environment or ecosystem of learning and a way for sharing that information in a way that makes it a little bit more actionable. So all of that kind of together, I think, provides a really powerful tool for these communities to access the kind of information and data that they can use to more effectively push their claims. So all of that was looking at things through our community hat, But to take that hat off and switch gears, I'd like to go through this process again rather briefly with the use case of an investor. So we can now imagine that we are investors considering opening up a new sector of investment in, say, infrastructure projects in Africa. And if that's not a sector that we're traditionally associated with investing in, we're probably really interested in learning about what risks might be associated with that, including reputational risks for our organization. And we also probably want to know more about the possibility of doing more harm than good, and about, if our group has our own defined impact metrics for investments, we want to make sure we have the information we need to see whether or not we're able to meet those defined impact metrics for these types of investments. So once again, instead of going all the way back to the homepage, we can jump right to the visualize page. So we can look at the kind of graphical representation of all the complaint data. And we're going to go through a similar process that we did before, get broader aggregate information about complaints as they apply to anything we're interested in, and then use that information to drill down into really specific granular data as it pertains to our use cases. So again, starting with our full set of 1,300 complaints, what we're going to do is drill down in this case to looking at infrastructure projects in Africa. So we can add Africa to our region filters and infrastructure to our sector filters. And we can immediately filter that list down from our 1,300 to 70 that now fit our use cases. And just looking at this visualized data, we can see right off the bat a few really interesting things here. One, explosive growth in the sector, particularly in the past 5 years. Looking at this, you can see that the eligibility distribution is really different than the one we just looked at earlier. If you remember, when we were looking at eligibility for the IDB finance projects in Latin America, we had an ineligibility rate of 80%. Here, we have an eligibility rate of almost 75%, which is almost the inverse of what we were looking at earlier. Now, again, I want to be clear that that doesn't necessarily say anything about the validity of the complaints one way or the other, but what it does say here is that you have a high number of independently verified eligible complaints, which means that there's a real risk of harm from investments in this sector, in this region. So immediately, that's something we want to look out for. And scrolling down this list, we can get a better sense of what those issues might be, by what issues are most commonly raised in these complaints in this sector, in this region. And we can see here that most common ones we're seeing are displacement, consultation, due diligence, and livelihoods. So we immediately know that we want to look out for those issues as we continue to do our due diligence for these types of investments. And I want to note that here, we're looking at all of this really high-level aggregated data, but what we can also do is we can look at these 70 complaints comparatively and break them down across particular variables if we really want to kind of pivot the data to understand its nuance a little bit better. So here we can compare the data by the accountability mechanism that handles the complaint, by the sector of the project, by issues, and we can see all that information here, and we can break them out apart differently. So just looking at the IMs, we can see, for example, that we're dealing with complaints related to 6 development banks, and that's it. So it's the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, the International Finance Corporation, the African Development Bank, the French Development Agency, and OPIC, the US Development Agency. So we can kind of see how complaints are handled differently across these different mechanisms. We can look at this information in relative values instead of absolute values if we want to get a sense of how they really compare to each other. But we can also look at breakdowns by issue or breakdowns by country if we wanted that kind of information. So, parsing through all of this data, we may want to increase the number of filters that we're using to get more granular data here again. So in this particular case, we can say that we're particularly interested in projects that have financing from the IFC, from the International Finance Corporation, which is the private arm of the World Bank. So, as a private investor, there are a lot of reasons we might be interested in that. They might be a partner that you work with on financing projects, but even if our hypothetical investment firm follows equator principles, that means that our due diligence standards are probably really similar to the IFC's performance standards. So seeing how the IFC applies or misapplies these standards would be really instructive for us. So again, we have our kind of high-level filters that we've been using so far up here, but we actually have a whole host of really advanced filters that people can use if they want to get into really granular data. But for now, all we have to do is add the IFC to our list of project filters for the bank. So we can add IFC MEGA here for our projects and add that to our filtering. And now we're going to go down from 70 complaints to, let's see, 16. So once again, we're able to really drill down into things that really matter to us particularly, and then derive information from those directly. So you've already seen the way that we can visualize this data, and you've seen the list, but the third way that you can look at this complaint data is geospatially. So obviously, with only 16 complaints, we're not going to see a super wide distribution here, but we will be able to kind of get a sense of where these complaints are being filed. And if, for example, we're particularly interested in West Africa, we can see which complaints are being filed out there. There's some in Guinea, there's some in Togo, and we got a complaint in Ghana. We can dig into that complaint in particular. And we can see here that this is a complaint about a port. And once again, we've got all the high-level complaint information here. We can see the issues that were raised by these complainants. We see consultation and disclosure, displacement, livelihoods. If you remember, these are the same issues that we saw earlier. But there's also a new one here, which is violence against the community. So that's a kind of little bit shocking and worrying issue that we want to make sure that, of course, if we're financing projects, infrastructure projects in Africa, we want to make sure that we're not inadvertently causing violence within the communities where we're investing. So that might be something that we want to dig into a little bit more. So again, we can go straight from here, looking at this particular complaint, to look at all the complaints that raise this issue. So that zooms us back out a little bit to look at all 36 complaints that have ever raised issues of violence against the community. And we can see these broken down by accountability office. And we can see right here that, a good number of them were filed to the IFC's accountability mechanism, which tells us right away that, that there is a real threat of private sector investing without addressing security risks to local people. So that's an issue that we're going to want to add to our due diligence that we know about because of our work on the Counsel. And then to stay apprised on this particular issue, in the same way that earlier when we had on our community hat, we followed a particular complaint, what we can do now, looking at this from our kind of investor angle, is to follow an issue. So here, on your dashboard, you can see whichever complaints you're following, but we can also add an issue to follow in its entirety. So by adding this violence against the community issue, we can see all the complaints that raise that issue right here on our dashboard, but we'll also be receiving email updates anytime any of these complaints update, if anything changes within any of those complaints, or if any new complaints are filed that also allege violence against the community, we'll be informed of that as well. So we can kind of stay on top of that issue as it relates to how it's being raised in these accountability mechanisms. So, this basically means that what we have here is concrete, actionable data about the S in ESG, right? Like the social aspect of the environmental, social, and governance standards that we'd be looking for as we tailor our due diligence research. So, in sum, looking at this in the aggregate, what have we learned here? We've learned that as an investor, we can identify the most common issues raised by communities themselves in a sector that we're interested in investing in. And we can really grapple with the real life risk factors that could either cause us to think twice about engaging with a particular type of investment, or might be something that we would want to pay close attention to throughout the life cycle of our investment if we do decide to go forward with it. And I think all of that basically shows a new way to hear and engage with community voices directly about what impacts they're experiencing as a result of these activities, what went wrong, and what solutions have been identified, sometimes by the communities themselves, for better outcomes in these scenarios. And of course, all of this is just a starting point for deeper research. But we hope that this system is a way to really encourage better practice, to learn lessons, and to share knowledge, so that past mistakes made in international financing of projects are learned from, and so new investments and new research can be built on top of that deal with community issues better based on what communities have said about how they're being impacted by them. And we hope that that's a really useful tool for people. We hope that all of those user groups that Natalie mentioned right at the beginning can derive real value from that. And it's something that frankly we derive a lot of value from directly. We here at Accountability Council, we use the system ourselves on a daily basis. So both our communities team and our policy team, and of course here in the research department, we're digging into the information as it relates to how we can pull out particular complaint data or what kind of aggregate information we can get. And we put that into practice. And where we are right now is really, we've come a really long way in the 2 years where we built this thing, but there's so much more to do. And we're really prioritizing making sure that we're building something that's really comprehensive. We want to make sure that we have all the complaint data that could possibly be included in the system included. We're grabbing it from every complaint registry we can get it from, as well as information from annual statements or wherever else we can get it. We're updating that information regularly to make sure that as complaint data is coming in, we're adding to this growing body of knowledge on a regular basis. But in addition to being comprehensive, we really want to make sure that it's intuitive. So it's not good enough that the information exists. We want to make sure that people are able to access that information easily and intuitively. So we've worked really hard on building a kind of responsive design, a really intuitive interface, a mobile accessible website style, so communities anywhere are able to access that information. And all of that is, of course, being vetted through our own internal team of experts who have been working on accountability issues for over a decade now. And so we can kind of apply our real life experience on both the communities and the policy side to make sure that we're getting the right data and we're presenting the right data in the right way. And then looking forward, things that we're really hoping to do here is really build out interoperability with other data sets. One of the things that I think is really great about building a new system like this, using really state-of-the-art technology, using really kind of a cutting-edge code, means that we're able to talk directly at the database level with other databases. So systems that our partners are building about, alerts related to new international financing, or looking at financial intermediaries, or information as it relates to anything in this kind of broader ecosystem, can kind of join together to create a sort of comprehensive set of data where we're supplying one major piece, but we're sharing that information with people who are more specialized in other pieces. And all of that is something that we're kind of doing iteratively with our partners and people that we're working with. So, we've been sharing the system for a couple of years now with our partners within the International Advocates Working Group, who have been using the console and kind of advising us on how it could be made more useful, what information would be great to add. We've been doing the same thing in our engagement directly with the accountability mechanisms themselves, getting advice back and thoughts on how we can refine and update the system. We're really trying to build something that solicits feedback from all the community of users, so that we can create something that's sort of a shared product for all of us. So we're building it here, but it's a feedback process that we're actively soliciting from all of you in an ongoing way. So those of you that use it, we really welcome your feedback and your thoughts on how we can make the system better. It's something that's changing every week, and we really appreciate the engagement that you all can provide to it. We've even actually got a little support button at the bottom right of every single page on the console that people can click to provide feedback or advice to us. And that's something we can use. We want to make sure that this product gets better, basically every day. And that's done by engaging with the users who are using it. So that's where we are right now. For those of you who aren't already on the system, we are providing a promo code for you to access a 30-day free trial if you want to sample those advanced features that I went through during this webinar. This is the same code that we sent to you in the email reminders for those of you who registered early. And that's the way you can just kind of hop in there and see all of this stuff for yourself if you haven't already. And that basically takes us to the end of the walkthrough. I would really love to hear any questions or thoughts that any of you have. By all means, please use the Q&A feature on the webinar to be able to ask questions directly, and we can respond to those questions from there. So hopefully all of you can see on Zoom a little Q&A button that you can use to ask any questions, and I'd be happy to answer them now, or Natalie or I would be happy to answer them.
Great, thank you so much, Samer. And I wanted to reiterate, we did get the question on language and the translatability, and we can go through and demo that specifically on a page if people are of interest. It's a Google Translate button that you can make the entire site into whatever language Google can understand. So many of them. I also wanted to mention, while we're waiting for any questions to come in, that the way that we're rolling this out is through this series of webinars. This is the first. We're going to be doing webinars and then in-person trainings for many of the stakeholder groups that we described. So if you had questions on that, just wanted to share that. So a question from Chris: investors would want to search by clients. How do we, and how many companies, and how many companies are currently in the database? So I'll hand that over to Samer.
Thanks, that is a great question, and unfortunately a kind of complicated one. One of the things that we've been prioritizing is not just looking at the complaint data, but aggregating that data up to look at project data and client data. So what we're trying to do is, find, say, if multiple complaints are filed about a single project, figuring out which of those projects, are dealing with multiple complaints, either at the same time or over a stretch of time. That's a much more complicated process than you think it might be, because different banks name their financing differently. So it's not always really intuitive when, say, a mine that's financed by, both the IFC and the European Investment Bank have had complaints filed to both of those accountability mechanisms. So drilling down to really figure out which projects we're dealing with here and which projects are fielding multiple complaints is a really important piece of this. And that information actually exists on the console. We didn't really get into the part that looks at financial institutions, their projects and their clients, but you can access that there.
Can you show that a moment, Samer? I know it might take a moment to navigate back to that, but I think that could be.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me pull that up. Sorry, just give me a second.
Yeah, no worries. So great answer. Great question. We'll show you, Chris, your way to that. Any other questions, feel free to type them into that Q&A button and we'll get to them next while we're looking here. And Chris, this is also related to the interoperability of what we have now on the database regarding companies and investors versus what we can do in the future.
Yeah, so you can see here, hopefully on my dashboard, we spent a lot of time talking about this complaint piece. We went into the accountability offices and the information that's there. I'd love to talk a little bit more about the support piece and the information that we provide to make all of this more accessible. But what Chris is referencing is we also have information on the financial institutions and information related to that. So we have project level data, and what we're looking at here is international financial institution financed projects and trying to figure out how many complaints were filed on those projects, so aggregating that data up. But what we also have, and this is more specific to Chris's question, is clients. So not just looking at what projects are people filing complaints about, but who are the clients that are receiving financing to implement these projects that are resulting in community complaints. So it's often the case where a government agency or some sort of private sector actor is receiving this money, and sometimes things go wrong. But because this information is so atomized, it doesn't really exist across banks. It could very well be the case that bad actors in the field possibly, are receiving countless millions of dollars of financing over the course of many years. And if most of those projects are resulting in community complaints, there's really no way for anybody to know that. And so what we're trying to do is identify who those clients are and track how the complaints are being managed by those entities. And that doesn't necessarily tell us one in the same way that the complaint data is really nuanced. Of course, the client data is also really nuanced. Like, I don't think it's inherently a bad thing that clients may have complaints filed against them, particularly if we find that those clients are willing to engage in dispute resolution processes, and that those dispute resolution processes are resulting in outcomes, or if a lot of investigations have been conducted against those clients and non-compliance isn't found. That tells you something really different than a client that has had a lot of complaints filed against them and they haven't been willing to engage in dialogue processes, or they've consistently been found to be non-compliant. That tells you a lot. This is a really advanced piece of what we're trying to do and requires a ton of really qualitative research. So it's still in its kind of embryonic stages, but so far we've tracked just over 300 clients, I believe, and we're adding more all the time. So hopefully it's going to be something that expands as we move forward.
Wonderful, Samar. Thanks so much. We've got some other questions coming in here. So I'm going to move to Dustin from Urgewald in Germany. He's asking whether we're considering including numbers related to displacement. An issue question.
Yeah, so that's also a great question. One of the things that we're really trying to do here is, as you saw earlier, we're spending a lot of time looking at sectors and issues to really understand which sectors of projects people are filing complaints about and what issues those complainants are raising. And one of our current projects right now is actually disaggregating each of those categories. So instead of just looking at the issue of displacement, which right now we categorize as displacement, economic or physical, what we would like to do is break that down into each of its subcomponents so you can look at really particular issues that complainants are raising. So you'd be able to identify, only physical displacement ones, and then in the same way that, if you're looking at, for example, labor issues, you might be interested in, forced labor issues or, like child labor issues, and you want to be able to disaggregate that. And part of what we want to do along with that disaggregation is linking that directly to the project documents that identify those issues. So in this particular example, if you were looking at physical displacement, you'd be able to filter that down and then see where either in the original complaint filing or in the compliance report or wherever else it might be, where those issues are being brought up. And presumably that would give you immediate access to more information related to those issues. So you can kind of pull out like, okay, like, how many people are they saying were displaced? So again, that's a pretty big project, but it's something that we've started working on actually last month. So we're really excited to kind of roll that out sometime soonish.
Great, thank you, Samar. And thanks, Dustin, for the question. We can move to Faye O'Brien's question about how communities file complaints and are they specific to organization mechanisms. So to handle that question first, communities unfortunately have a lot of barriers to face in figuring out how to file a complaint and also whether they can file a complaint and to where. That's why I founded Accountability Council a decade ago, because communities really need a lot of help and support bridging those barriers to knowing they've experienced harm or fearing harm and then understanding what they can do about it. So we really see civil society organizations, of course, not just Accountability Council, but there are hundreds of organizations around the world who are using accountability offices, and we want to encourage growth of that field so that communities can reach out for support to a local civil society organization who's trained and experienced to know that first you need to research who has invested in the project that's caused harm, and then explore whether they have an accountability office. And if they do have one, these organizations can facilitate support for filing a complaint directly to the accountability office of the institution that has financed the project that has caused harm. So it's a complicated answer. There's quite a bit to it, and we can talk more about it, Faye. If you'd like to follow up, we're happy to do so. That's just a quick answer that we probably have time for now. Your second question was the annual cost of a subscription for NGOs. And if Sam, if you want to go to our pricing list page so people know where to find this information under support, we have a fee waiver for civil society organizations wanting to use the console who are on a limited budget. So you would just have to complete the registration page and request the fee waiver. And then the other pricing is listed here on a sliding scale for all other users. And we're a very small nonprofit organization, and so we're really wanting this to be a sustainable long-term tool for people to use, and we're making the investment in doing it with the hopes that people are going to be able to subscribe to support that going forward. So that is Faye's question. And then I can move to Esteban Tovar from the Inter-American Development Bank from MISI, the Accountability Office. He says, thank you for the presentation. Here at MISI, we are wondering how often you will be updating the data set and how you are identifying the issues. Wonderful question. I'll hand that to Samer.
Yeah, it's a really great question. So we are doing our best to basically stay on top of new complaint data constantly. So we have a system of sort of auto-updating the information that goes into this database, although all of it needs to be vetted internally by staff. So that allows us to kind of update information, not immediately, but pretty quickly after it shows up on the registries. Obviously, there's a wide range of like when complaints are put on those registries. There are also a subset of complaints that never make it to the registries for particular mechanisms, particularly complaints that don't make it through registration processes or eligibility processes, but we are committed to including those as well. But unfortunately, we can only get those through annual statements or other means, and so they show up at most a year out, but the other ones pretty quickly to the extent that we can.
Great, and Esteban, feel free to ask follow-up questions, and thank everybody for typing these questions. We appreciate it. It helps us move along here. I'd like to move to Andrea Kemp from Germany. She's asking, insofar as you're using human rights criteria for disaggregation, for example, criteria for evictions to be human rights based, what are the definitions essentially that we're using? Are they similar for labor issues, core labor standards, indigenous rights, UN DRIP, ILO 169, and so on? So how are we categorizing these human rights criteria is the question. I'll hand that to you, Samer.
It's a really good question. So we're in that process of subcategorization as we speak, and we're really lucky to have a couple of volunteer data scientists who are working with us at Well to kind of really identify how we can specify the exact terms of each of these things to make sure that they're as objective as possible. And so for labor, yeah, we've basically been looking at like international labor standards and international international standards of labor violations as the kind of core criteria that we use. But in this kind of early stage, we're really trying to identify what the most salient subcategories would be and how exactly to identify them. As you can imagine, this is an issue actually not just for this subcategorization of issues, but basically everything that we put into a kind of bucket of categorization within our system. So, you know, as you can imagine, each of these different accountability mechanisms has their own classification criteria for what constitutes a sector or what constitutes an issue. And we've had to sort of create a standardized rubric for that information as a way to sort of make the data comparable across institutions. And we've done our best to be transparent about all of that. You can actually see we've got a glossary here in the support section, which shows how we define each of these terms. So looking at like each of the issues that are defined within all of those categories, you can see how we define them, like what we define as a biodiversity issue, what we define as a cultural heritage issue, and we use those definitions as a kind of baseline way to set those standards. But as I mentioned earlier, we really want this to be as consultative and collaborative a process as possible, so any thoughts you all have on that are more than welcome.
Great, thank you, Samer. And we have a question from, I believe this is Marvin Garcia in Belize, asking, is there a mechanism to upload pictures and photos? Great question, Samer.
I love that question. It's something that we really, we've thought a lot about, and we would love for this system to be a really interactive way for people who are kind of, you know, right now it's largely a repository of information as it relates to the mechanisms themselves. But what we really want is something that produces a kind of collaborative, community-based response where you can kind of see the knowledge that's being produced from all parties. Right now, the system for doing that is, if you look at a particular complaint, for example, you would use this support button that I mentioned earlier, this like little bottom right one that allows you to kind of send information. That information comes back to us, we vet it, and we add it. But what we would like to see, you know, at some point is a kind of more directly interactive approach or different people who are following a particular complaint, if they're all interested parties or they're all engaged in it in some way, or they're doing research around it, to have a conversation around it, to share information and to share files, and to add those to the repository of knowledge. So we've actually started doing that a little bit. If I can look for a particular complaint, I believe it's this one, where the NGO in Bolivia that was involved in this complaint was looking at this complaint page and was like, oh, you've got all these documents from MISI, which great, MISI is really wonderful about like disclosing all of these documents, but they were like, we would love to include our own documentation about this case as well. And so they sent us their own report that they produced about this complaint process. And so we can include that information in here as well as a way to kind of see the full holistic community and process experience of these complaints. But we want to improve that process as much as we can.
And we're obviously aware that there are a number of security issues with uploading pictures and community driven information that we're very attuned to. So this is not a straightforward answer to that question, but something that we're thinking quite a bit about, and which layers of information people have that ensure the security of communities who face quite a number of risks in raising their voices and filing complaints.
Yeah.
I wanted to move to a question from Nora. She's asking, what are some of the interest or stakeholder groups you'll do special trainings for? Do you envision including journalists in any of these trainings? So the next stakeholder group, we're going to be doing one for the mechanisms themselves shortly, one for funders, and we do plan on having webinars and trainings for every single one of the stakeholder groups as we are able to develop the time and the capacity to do so with our small team. And anyone who's interested in helping to organize that is welcome to request a training, to offer support in organizing it. We'd really be happy to collaborate with people on these as we roll this out, since this is a new system. So hopefully that answers that question. It's not scheduled yet, but hopefully we will. Moving to Andrea, follow-up comment, not a question. I understand there are differences between mechanisms. I think standardizing along human rights criteria would enable alignment of complaints with human rights obligations of both IFIs as well as clients. Point well noted, Andrea, and a good point for our follow-up discussions that we look forward to having with you about how this works. Any other questions that people didn't get a chance to write down yet or haven't gotten to? Or any follow-up? I think we actually have one from Esteban. He's putting a more fine point on his question, I believe, which is wondering how often you'll be updating the data set and how you are identifying the issues from the requests or the reports. I'm not sure if we answer how we're translating what we're seeing in the requests and reports to how they get classified. Samer, do you feel like we should spend another moment on that one?
Yeah, sure. So basically the process is grabbing the new information and bringing it to us is a semi-automated process, but then we have our own kind of internal kind of due diligence that we do on each of these complaints before they go into our system, which goes through our sort of predetermined like process of aligning all of the information into a kind of comparative standard. And this is sort of what I was talking about earlier, that we pull out the issues that a complainant might raise in their filing. We compare them to our criteria for which issues are classified in which particular way. And then when all of that information is put into that kind of standardized format, then it's added to the site. It's tested by our kind of internal, security and privacy policies, and then it gets published live. So it's honestly a really involved process.
And so that, yeah, and to answer that question specifically, it is from the requests, not the reports, that we're using as the starting point for how.
Yes, we're using the request as the starting point overwhelmingly. That's right.
And I know we're at an hour. We still have almost everyone who started the call with us, which is great. So thank you so much for spending your hour with us and learning about the console. We really look forward to hearing from all of you, your feedback of what you learned, what you'd like to still learn about this, and further engagement. We really, again, to reiterate what Samer said, want this to be a interactive and a really important tool for everybody to get value from. So we look forward to being in touch, and thank you so much for all of your time today. If you do have follow-up questions, feel free to be in touch. And thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.